Tonight, we begin with a thing so small that it can hide under a fingertip, roll beneath a table, and be missed only when the wind finds the gap in a coat. A button seems almost too ordinary to deserve a history. It waits on cuffs, shirts, gowns, waistcoats, breeches, cloaks, and work smocks, holding cloth in its quiet position while the body walks, bends, kneels, carries, cooks, trades, and sleeps. Yet before factories made buttons by the thousands, before machines stamped them into sameness, each one belonged to a chain of hands and materials. Bone might have come from a butcher's yard. Horn might have softened in warm water near a hearth. Shell might have crossed a harbor in a sack that still smelled faintly of tide. Wood might have been cut from a branch saved after pruning. Thread, cloth, pasteboard, metal wire, linen scraps, and patience all took their turn. In the world before industrial abundance, fastenings mattered because cloth mattered. Cloth was not casual. It carried the labor of sheep, flax fields, spinners, weavers, dyers, fullers, tailors, laundresses, and menders. A garment could represent weeks of work, months of saving, or the inheritance of someone else's careful use. To close it properly was not a minor convenience. A good button kept heat near the chest, protected modesty, helped a sleeve stay clear of flame, and made a patched coat look orderly enough for market, chapel, or a visit to a creditor. Buttons also spoke softly of status. A plain wooden disc on a laborer's coat said one thing. A shining mother-of-pearl button on a cuff said another. A cloth-covered button, made from the same fabric as the garment, could suggest refinement even when the core beneath it was humble. Before we follow the making, it helps to slow down and imagine the rooms where this work began. They were not always grand workshops. Some were sheds with low benches, tailoring rooms above noisy streets, kitchens where useful scraps gathered in boxes, or small specialized shops where a craftsperson repeated the same delicate motions from morning until the light failed. The air might hold sawdust, damp wool, vinegar, glue, chalk, lamp smoke, and the warm animal scent of horn or bone being worked. Tools waited close by: awls, small drills, files, knives, punches, shears, needles, polishing rags, bits of leather for gripping, and bowls filled with pieces not yet worthy of being called buttons. The work was not one craft, but many neighboring crafts. A bone button maker thought differently from someone covering wooden molds with silk. A shell cutter listened for cracks that another worker would never hear. A tailor sewing thread buttons for linen underclothes used the fingers like a small loom. A household servant saving loose buttons from worn-out garments practiced a kind of economy that rarely entered ledgers, though it kept families clothed. In that way, the button was both manufactured and domestic, both traded and rescued, both decorative and deeply practical. So we will move gently, not through a factory line, but through a slower landscape of materials arriving, being sorted, cut, softened, pierced, wrapped, polished, rejected, saved, and finally sewn to clothing. There will be no hurry here. The subject asks for patience. If you are settling in with boring nights, you are very welcome to like this video and subscribe. Only if that feels pleasant and useful to you. It helps keep these quiet histories coming. For now, let the day dim, let the bench come into view, and let one small button become large enough to hold a whole world of hands. Before any button took shape, material had to arrive at the door. It came without romance, tied in bundles, wrapped in cloth, tipped from baskets, or carried in sacks that left dust on the floor. In a town with trades close together, a button maker might know the butcher, the comb maker, the turner, the shell merchant, the tailor, and the rag seller by name. Each had cast-offs that could become useful if a patient hand understood them. The pre-factory button began not as an invention, but as a possibility in something already present. A shin bone, a horn tip, a shell, a sliver of hardwood, a scrap of wool, a coil of linen thread. Bone often came from the ordinary traffic of meat. Cattle, sheep, and other animals fed households first. Their remains then moved through secondary trades. Large bones, once cleaned enough to be bearable, offered dense, pale material that could be sawed into plates or small blanks. They were never perfectly uniform. A bone had grain, curve, porous places, and stronger places. The maker had to read it, like weather. Too near the hollow center and the button might be weak. Too close to a crack and the effort would be wasted. Even before cutting, there was sorting, and sorting was a form of knowledge. Horn arrived differently. Horn was not bone, though people sometimes speak of them together. It came from the outer sheath of animals such as cattle, and it could be softened by heat and moisture, pressed, flattened, cut, and shaped. In the hands of comb makers and button makers, horn had a flexible character that rewarded care and punished impatience. Dark horn, amber horn, streaked horn, and pale horn all promised different appearances. Some pieces could be polished until they glowed in a mild smoky way, like tea seen through a thin cup. Other pieces were better for hidden fastenings, where strength mattered more than beauty. Shell and mother of pearl traveled from shores, rivers, and trade routes. In some districts, freshwater mussel shell became a local resource. In others, ocean shell moved through merchants before reaching a bench. The inner nacre, with its cool shifting light, made buttons that looked far more luxurious than their size suggested. But shell was hard, brittle, and dusty when cut. It broke along secret lines. It could chip where the maker expected smoothness. A bag of shell was not merely a bag of shine. It was also a bag of failures waiting to happen. Wood came quietly. Boxwood, fruitwood, beech, and other close-grained pieces could serve for plain buttons or for forms later covered with cloth. A turner might produce little discs, domes, or molds, while a tailor or household worker supplied the covering. Wood was familiar, warm to the fingers, and common enough to seem humble. Yet the right piece mattered. A knot, split, or soft patch might ruin a button that had to survive rain, sweat, pulling thread, and years of use. Thread, cloth, and scraps arrived as well. Linen thread, wool yarn, silk twist, old garment pieces, and narrow remnants from a tailor's table were all part of the world of buttons. A thread button could be built around rings, or stitched into a firm little form by repeated wrapping. A cloth-covered button could turn a plain core into something that matched a bodice or coat. Nothing here was separate from the larger economy of clothing. The materials arrived with smells of stable, shoreline, forest, dye vat, laundry, and storage chest. The maker did not receive perfect ingredients. The maker received the world in fragments, and from those fragments selected what might close a garment and accompany a body through another day. The first labor after arrival was often not cutting or drilling, but looking. A worker sat with a heap of irregular things and made quiet decisions. This shell could be used. That bone was too thin. This horn had a fine color but a troublesome split. That wood had dried unevenly and might warp. The scene is easy to overlook because sorting does not announce itself as skilled work. It has no bright finished object yet. It is simply a pair of hands moving pieces from one pile to another while daylight changes on the table. But, in pre-factory making, judgment at the beginning saved sorrow later. Bone required particular attention. Cleaned bone might still hold grease in its pores, or a faint animal smell that returned when warmed by tools. It had to be whitened, dried, and examined. Some makers boiled or soaked it. Practices varied by place, price, and habit. A button did not need the finest part of an animal, but it needed enough strength to endure a hole drilled through it, and a thread pulled tight. The worker looked for density, steadiness, and an area broad enough to yield a small round or oval. Long bones were useful because they offered length, but their curve could complicate the work. Flatness, or the possibility of being made flat, mattered. Horn asked for another kind of reading. A horn sheath had natural layers and a direction to its fibers. If cut carelessly, it could split or feather at the edge. A worker sorting horn might hold it toward a window to see translucence, then turn it to judge color. Horn could imitate tortoiseshell, or present its own dark bands. It could be used for sturdy coat buttons, country garments, or finer pieces when polished well. Yet horn was alive with memory of its shape. It wanted to curve. Flattening it took heat, pressure, and time, and even after that, a stubborn piece might try to return to itself. Shell sorting was more delicate. The outer surface might be rough, chalky, or stained, while the inner surface held the nacre people desired. Mother of pearl was valued for its pale, changing gleam, but the luminous layer was not evenly spread. A worker had to avoid wormholes, dull patches, and fractures. Shell dust was unpleasant, and could be harmful when breathed, though past workers did not always have the language or protection we would expect today. They knew, however, that cutting shell tired the lungs and dried the throat. The best pieces were saved for visible buttons, while lesser areas might become smaller goods or be discarded. Wood, though kinder to tools, had its own quiet refusals. A small button exposed to damp cloth and repeated handling needed close grain. A soft wood might dent. A poorly seasoned piece might crack after the button had been covered and sewn on, making the earlier labor vanish into disappointment. The sorter tapped, flexed, smelled, and weighed pieces in the hand. Good wood had a certain honesty to it. It did not promise shine like shell or depth like horn, but it could be steady. Cloth and thread were sorted by color, strength, and cleanliness. A silk scrap too small for a sleeve might cover several buttons. Linen thread that was too coarse for fine sewing might still make a durable wrapped fastener. Tailors saved pieces because waste had a cost. Households kept button boxes because the future was always asking for small repairs. Sorting, then, was not merely preparation. It was thrift, made visible. It was the patient art of asking each fragment what it could still become, and accepting that some pieces, despite all hope, would never hold. A button maker's tools were small enough to look harmless. A narrow saw, a bow drill, a punch, a file, an awl, a scraper, a clamp, a knife, a pair of shears, and a smoothing stone do not seem dramatic when laid on a bench. They are not the tools of shipyards or quarries. Yet they punished the hands in quieter ways. Their work was close, repetitive, and exacting. They demanded pressure from fingertips, steadiness from wrists, and attention from eyes already tired by dim light. A large mistake in a large trade might at least be seen coming. In button work, a slip could happen inside a breath. To cut bone or horn, the maker first needed a manageable piece. Saws with fine teeth reduced larger material into strips or plates. The sound was thin and persistent, a dry rasp that settled into the room. Bone dust gathered pale in cracks. Horn gave a different resistance, sometimes smoother, sometimes stringier, depending on heat, age, and thickness. Shell required even more caution. It was beautiful after polishing, but during cutting it behaved like a brittle secret. Too much pressure might send a crack across the surface. Too little pressure, and the work dragged on until the arm ached. Drilling holes seems simple, only after the hole exists. Before factories, many holes were made with hand drills, bow drills, or small pointed tools, turned again and again. A 2-hole or 4-hole button needed not only openings, but openings placed evenly enough that the button sat well and did not tear its thread. The maker might mark the center with a prick of an awl, then set the drill with care. If the bit wandered, the button became crooked. If the pressure split the blank, the whole piece went into the reject pile. Each hole was small, but each small hole carried the fate of the object. Files shaped edges. Scrapers removed roughness. Polishing rags brought out a modest shine. These finishing tools required patience more than strength. But patience can tire the body too. The thumb learned where to brace. The forefinger grew tender where it guided a piece. Shoulders rounded forward over the bench. In cold weather, stiff fingers made the tool less trustworthy. In summer, sweat made small blanks slippery. The work did not stop being precise just because the person doing it was hungry, chilled, or distracted. Tools for thread and cloth buttons had a gentler appearance, but were no less demanding. Needles, thimbles, rings, molds, and tight linen or silk thread created firm little structures by wrapping, stitching, and drawing the thread evenly around a core. A thread button, especially the kinds used on shirts and underlinen, could be made almost entirely from repeated passes of thread. It needed to be compact, washable, and comfortable against the body. Cloth-covered buttons required shears to cut circles, needles to gather fabric around a wooden or pasteboard form, and a neatness that hid the rough underside from view. A button could be plain underneath, but the visible face had to behave. The bench itself became part of the tool. Nicks in the wood held dust from old work. A shallow hollow from years of pressure caught rolling blanks. A candle or oil lamp extended the day but changed colors and deepened shadows. The maker learned where to place the hand so the drill did not bite the skin, where to keep rejected pieces, and how to hear when a file met a hidden flaw. This was not mechanized repetition. It was bodily repetition. The tool did not guide the worker so much as ask the worker, again and again, to be accurate while becoming tired. There is a moment in handwork when a piece of material stops being only itself and begins to suggest its future. A cut of bone is still bone, but the circle marked on it has changed the way the eye sees it. A horn plate is still horn, yet after warming and pressing it flat, a row of possible buttons seems to appear across its surface. A shell that once belonged to water now lies under a compass point, and the pale inner layer offers small moons to be cut free. This first transformation is slow, because the maker must persuade material rather than command it. Bone often began with cleaning and reduction. The useful outer wall was separated from parts that were too porous or irregular. A strip might be sawed, scraped, and flattened as much as possible. Then small rounds could be marked. Some makers used punches or tubular cutters. Others sawed and filed. The blank was rough at first, with edges that caught the skin. It looked unfinished in every way. But even then, one could see the button waiting. The worker turned it in the fingers, judged its thickness, and decided whether it deserved more labor. Horn's first change could feel almost alchemical, though it was practical knowledge passed through trade and habit. Heat and moisture softened it. Pressed between boards or under weights, it became flatter and more obedient. If overheated, it might blister, smell sharply, or weaken. If neglected, it might curl again. The maker knew that horn had to be treated with patience, like a stubborn strip of weather. Once flattened, it could be cut into shapes, dyed in some cases, polished, or left with its natural streaks. It made buttons that were light, resilient, and pleasant in a subdued way. Shell transformation was harsher. The beauty of mother of pearl did not come forward without abrasion. The rough exterior might be ground away, and discs cut from the nacreous layer needed careful shaping. Water could help settle dust and cool the work. But small shops were not always kind to lungs or eyes. The maker sought a surface that would catch light softly, not with the glare of a jewel, but with the quiet change of moonlight in a basin. A shell button could make an otherwise plain garment seem cared for. It gave a cuff or shirt front a glimmer that moved when the wearer breathed. Wood was more forgiving, especially in the hands of a turner. A small branch or block could be mounted and shaped into round molds or simple discs. The turning tool made shavings that curled away with a dry, sweet smell, depending on the timber. For uncovered wooden buttons, the surface might be smoothed and sealed. For cloth-covered buttons, the wood's purpose was partly hidden. It supplied body, firmness, and shape, while the fabric supplied appearance. This was a quiet partnership between tree and textile. Thread and cloth began transforming with the first wrap or gathering stitch. A ring could be filled by crossings of linen thread until it became a little wheel. A fabric circle could be drawn around a core, tightened at the back, and made to match the garment from which it seemed to grow. These buttons remind us that not every pre-factory fastener was cut from hard material. Some were built from softness made firm by repetition. The maker's skill lay in even tension, clean edges, and a face that did not pucker. Nothing was finished yet. The pieces remained vulnerable to splitting, staining, uneven holes, and poor polish. But they had crossed an invisible line. They were no longer mere scraps. They had entered the long middle of making, where every additional minute increased their value, and every mistake became more expensive. Many old crafts contain long pauses that do not look like work unless you understand what is being waited for. Button making before factories had its share of them. Bone might need soaking, boiling, drying, or whitening. Horn might need softening before it could be flattened, and time under pressure before it would keep its new form. Shell might be dampened while it was ground or cut, partly to control dust and partly to cool the stubborn surface. Cloth-covered buttons might wait while paste dried, or while a garment fitting determined how many matching pieces were needed. The hand was important, but so were water, weight, air, and time. Water entered the craft in practical ways. It cleaned, softened, cooled, and sometimes disguised unpleasantness for a little while. Bone that came too fresh from the butcher's world had to be made fit for handling. Boiling could remove grease, though not always completely. Soaking might loosen matter that had no place on a workbench. In some places, bleaching in sun, or with available treatments, helped make bone paler, especially for buttons meant to look clean against linen. Yet water could also harm if drying was careless. Material that held moisture might warp, smell, or weaken. Horn responded to warmth and dampness with a slow yielding. A horn plate softened enough could be pressed flat between boards, under stones, in a screw press, or beneath whatever weight a small workshop could manage. The room might smell faintly animal, warm, and sharp. The maker did not need to speak of chemistry to know the rule. Hurry spoils. Too much heat, and the horn's surface suffered. Too little, and it resisted the press. After pressing came waiting, because a piece removed too soon might curl at the edges like a leaf near fire. Wait was a humble partner. It had no skill, yet it made skill possible. A board weighted with stones could hold horn in submission. A clamp could keep a strip steady while a saw found its line. A press could flatten material enough for later cutting. In cloth-covered work, pressure helped shape the fabric around the core, smoothing the face and persuading folds to lie at the back. The maker used weight, not as violence, but as steady insistence. Small objects often require this kind of force, not a blow, but a long, quiet leaning. Weighting also belonged to thread and fabric. Linen thread might be waxed, so it passed cleanly and resisted fraying. Cloth pieces might be dampened slightly to shape over a form, then left to dry. Pasteboard cores, when used, disliked excess moisture and could swell or soften. A tailor making a row of covered buttons for a coat had to consider the whole garment, the fabric's thickness, the lining of the front, the spacing of buttonholes, and the way the wearer moved. A button made too quickly might look acceptable in the hand and disappointing once sewn in place. The pre-factory day moved around these pauses. While horn rested under weight, bone blanks could be filed. While shell dust settled, thread buttons could be wrapped. While cloth dried, a worker could sort the next bundle or mend a tool handle. Time was not empty. It was arranged. It had corners filled with secondary tasks, household interruptions, meals, customers, children, weather, and light. This is one reason handmade things carry irregularity. They were made inside days that had to be managed, not inside perfectly controlled systems. A button might remember rain because drying took longer. It might remember winter because fingers were clumsy. It might remember a crowded household because work was lifted aside when the table was needed for food. Water and weight shaped the object before any final polish appeared. The small fastener rested, pressed between forces, learning slowly how to keep its form. By the time the morning had settled, the workshop knew its own rhythm. The maker did not need to announce the order of work. Hands reached for the familiar tool, eyes moved toward the better light, and the body found the position it had used yesterday. In a room where buttons were made or finished before factories, habit was a kind of lamp. It illuminated what an outsider would miss, which blank deserved careful polishing, which shell disc sounded wrong, which length of thread had enough strength, which piece of cloth would cover a mold without pulling thin at the edge. The workshop might be a single trade room, but it could also be part of a household. A bench near a window served while daylight lasted. Shelves held boxes labeled only by memory. Bone pieces lay apart from horn because their dust, smell, and treatment differed. Shell was kept where it would not be crushed. Wooden form sat in a shallow tray. Cloth scraps were folded, not because they were precious in the grand sense, but because even a narrow remnant could become useful if kept clean. A button shop did not need to be large to contain a surprising amount of order. Sound filled the day in small measures. A file rubbed. A drill turned. Shears closed with a dry click. Thread passed through fabric with a tiny whisper. A shell piece tapped the bench and gave back a note that might reassure or worry the worker. Outside, carts moved. A church bell marked time, or a neighbor opened shutters. Inside, the work remained close. Button making did not ask the whole body to stride across space. It asked the body to return to the same few inches of table until those inches became a map. Apprentices, children, spouses, or hired helpers might share the labor, depending on the place and period. One person could sort blanks. Another could polish. Another might sew cloth covers or count finished pieces into dozens. In tailoring rooms, covered buttons were often part of a larger garment-making process, and the person making them had to think ahead to buttonholes, facing, lining, and the final fall of the cloth. In household work, a woman or servant might repair, replace, or make simple thread buttons as part of the endless maintenance of clothing. The history of buttons belongs not only to named craftsmen, but to many people whose work disappeared into wear. Light mattered constantly. Near a window, mother of pearl showed its colors more honestly. By candle or lamp, a flaw might hide until morning. A dark horn button could vanish against the shadowed bench. A cloth-covered button made in poor light might reveal mismatched grain later, when it was too late to fix easily. Pre-factory work depended on natural conditions, more than we usually remember. The maker arranged the day around brightness, saving close drilling, or color, matching for clearer hours when possible. The room also held fatigue. Habit helped, but it could not remove soreness from fingers or dust from the throat. A worker might pause to flex the hand, wipe a tool, sharpen a blade, or warm stiff fingers around a cup. The pace was not the smooth pace of later machinery. It fluttered and resumed. It adjusted to the body. It accepted interruptions, then gathered itself again. In such a workshop, the button gained its quiet identity. It was not born from a single dramatic act. It accumulated decisions. A little more filing. A steadier hole. A better scrap chosen for the face. A final rub across cloth to remove dust. Habit did not make the work careless. It made care repeatable. Under ordinary light, among ordinary tools, the button became reliable enough to be forgotten once it reached the garment, which was perhaps the highest compliment a useful object could receive. At the bench, a failed button can seem almost comic from a distance. One cracked shell disc, one crooked hole, one loose cloth cover, one split wooden mold. Surely the world continues. And it does. But for the person at the bench, mistakes gathered weight. Each spoiled piece carried the time already spent selecting, cutting, warming, pressing, drilling, wrapping, or polishing. In a pre-factory workshop, waste was not hidden in vast production numbers. It sat nearby in a dish, visible and accusing, reminding the maker that small objects can still consume a day. Bone could fail after behaving well for several steps. A blank might look firm, until the drill reached a weak place near the center. Then a hairline crack opened, perhaps too fine to notice at once, but large enough to break when thread pulled through. If the button was for a work garment, strength mattered more than shine. A weak button on a coat could mean a cold gap in bad weather or a repair needed at the worst time. The maker learned to distrust surfaces that looked too easy. Horn had its own forms of mischief. It could curl after pressing, split along layers, or scorch if warmed carelessly. A polished horn button might show handsome streaks, but if the edge was left sharp, it could wear through thread. If the hole was rough inside, the fastening would slowly cut itself free from the garment. Many failures were not immediate. They waited until the customer had paid, until the coat had been worn in rain, until the button had been tugged again and again by cold fingers. A good maker feared those delayed complaints. Shell was beautiful and unforgiving. Mother of pearl could chip near a hole or fracture across a luminous face. A disc might lose its best color when ground too thin. The dust could cloud the bench and cling to damp skin. Sometimes a piece that seemed generous yielded only one usable button after flaws were avoided. The cutter had to place each circle with care, turning the shell to use its nacre wisely. A poor decision at the marking stage could waste the very part that made the shell worth cutting. Wooden buttons and molds failed more quietly. A hidden split might open when a needle pulled fabric tight around it. A mold too thick could make a covered button bulky, too thin, and it might feel mean or fragile. Cloth-covered buttons could pucker, wrinkle, or show the wrong direction of weave. If several were meant to run down the front of a bodice or coat, they had to look like a family. One odd button in a row drew the eye. The maker might unpick and recover it, losing thread and time, or set it aside for some less visible use. Thread buttons demanded tension. Too loose, and the little structure sagged. Too tight, and it warped or became hard in a way that felt unpleasant against the body. The thread had to cross evenly, filling space without tangling into a lump. Such buttons were often made for linen garments that were washed, worn close to the skin, and expected to survive practical life. Their beauty was not display, but endurance. There were mistakes of counting and matching too. Coat needed a set. A shirt required enough small fastenings. A customer might ask for replacements that resembled old ones, and resemblance could be difficult when the original buttons had aged with sun, sweat, smoke, and washing. Before standardized factory stock, matching was an art of approximation. The maker searched boxes, compared shades, and hoped the difference would soften with use. So the day could be ruined by very little. A dull drill, a cracked shell, damp weather, poor light, impatience, or a knock at the wrong moment might undo careful work. Yet the quiet discipline of the trade was to continue. The reject dish filled, but so did the tray of usable pieces. Not perfect, not identical, not effortless, but good enough to hold cloth together. In that modest success, the small button earned its place. Before a button could be drilled, smoothed, polished, soled, sewn, or lost in the lining of a coat, it first had to be separated from something larger. That first act was often cutting, and it was neither as simple nor as mechanical as later factory work would make it seem. A maker looked at a piece of horn, bone, wood, shell, leather, or metal, and tried to imagine small circles hiding inside it. The material offered room in some places, and danger in others. It held cracks, grain, thin patches, color, knots, and curves. The quiet judgment of the hand began before any tool touched the surface. Bone blanks might be marked from cleaned pieces that had already been sawn and flattened, as well as the maker could manage. Bone was hard enough to keep an edge and pale enough to please the eye, but it was not uniform. The outer wall, the inner hollow, and the old life of the animal all shaped what could be taken from it. A button cutter avoided porous places and looked for sound material that would not crumble near the holes. In a small workshop, each usable patch mattered. Waste was not an abstract cost. It lay on the bench in pale chips. Horn asked for a different patience. It might be softened with heat and pressed flatter before blanks were taken. Its layered nature could reward the worker with warm brown translucence or punish haste with splitting. A circle cut against a weak layer could later peel apart, especially after weather and wear. The cutter learned to read the direction of the horn, much as a joiner read wood. Some pieces were suitable for plain work coats, some for better garments, and some for nothing but small scraps after flaws had been trimmed away. Shell cutting had its own slow brightness. Mother of pearl did not give up circles kindly. It was hard, abrasive, and sometimes treacherous under a beautiful surface. The best color might sit in a narrow band, while the rest was dull or brittle. A worker might shift a marker again and again, seeking the place where the shine would fall in the center of a future button. Cutting shell produced dust that caught in the throat and settled like fine chalk. The work could look delicate from a distance, but the tools met a stubborn, sea-made substance. For wooden buttons or wooden molds meant to be covered with cloth, the grain mattered most. A blank cut too near a knot might split when wrapped. A disc taken across poor grain could warp in damp air. The tool might be a small saw, a punch, a knife, a bow-driven cutter, or whatever the local trade and purse allowed. There were specialized implements in some workshops, but many makers worked with modest means. The point was to make repeatable shapes without pretending that every piece of material was the same. Cutting also required a sense of number. A tailor might need a row for a coat. A seamstress might require a set for a child's jacket, and a household might ask only for replacements. One button alone could be charming. A row demanded kinship. The cutter therefore tried to take blanks from neighboring parts of the material, so that color, thickness, and texture would not vary too sharply. If the finished buttons were to sit side by side, their beginnings had to be planned together. The sound of this work was small and persistent. A scrape, a tap, a tightened clamp, a blade drawn back, the dry whisper of waste falling aside. There was little drama in it, yet cutting decided much of what followed. A badly placed blank made drilling harder, smoothing longer, and polishing less successful. A well-chosen circle gave the later stages a kind of ease. In the old button trades, skill often meant preventing trouble before anyone else could see that trouble was possible. So the first circle was not merely a shape. It was a promise made between tool and material. The maker promised not to force too much, not to waste what was sound, and not to trust beauty without testing it. The material promised nothing in return, except what it could honestly bear. Out of that modest agreement came the small round pieces that would one day fasten linen, wool, leather, silk, and homespun close around ordinary lives. A finished button seems to accept thread, as if the holes had always belonged there. In truth, those openings were small acts of risk. Drilling could rescue a well-cut blank and make it useful, or it could ruin the work already invested in cutting and shaping. Before powered machinery made holes by the thousands, the maker had to hold the piece, steady the point, judge the pressure, and listen for the change in resistance. The drill did not know that the disc was nearly finished. It only knew where the hand sent it. Some drills were simple and ancient in their principle. A bow drill, a pump drill, a hand brace, or a small awl-like tool could turn a point through bone, horn, wood, or shell. The arrangement varied by region, period, and trade, but the demand remained familiar. The holes had to be placed evenly and opened cleanly. A button with one hole too near the edge might break under thread. A pair set crookedly could make the button sit strangely on cloth. 4 holes required an even little square, not a wandering constellation. The maker often marked the center before drilling. A faint prick from a point helped guide the bit. On better buttons, spacing was part of the appearance as well as the strength. The eye notices disorder quickly on a small round face. A plain bone button could look careless if its holes leaned together. A polished horn button could lose dignity through one uneven opening. The work was minute, but not invisible. It waited for daylight, for a customer's glance, or for the tailor's needle. Bone gave a dry resistance. The bit could squeak faintly, and fine pale powder gathered near the hole. If the blank was too thin, the tool might burst through roughly on the far side. If it was too thick, the button might sit heavily and make sewing awkward. A careful worker sometimes drilled partly from one face and then finished from the other, trying to reduce splintering. Such small precautions took time, and time was the ordinary price of a sound fastening. Horn behaved more quietly, until it did not. It might stretch a little, warm under friction, or catch along a layer. A hole that seemed clean at first could show a feathered edge after cooling. Because horn was often chosen for practical garments, the inside of the hole mattered greatly. Roughness there could abrade thread each time the coat was fastened. The maker might pass a finer point through again or smooth the opening with a small tool, not for show, but to keep the button from sawing itself loose in use. Mother of pearl was less forgiving. Its beauty came with brittleness, and drilling shell required restraint. Too much pressure near the edge could chip the nacre. The dust was sharp and unpleasant. A worker leaned close enough to guide the point, yet not so carelessly as to breathe more dust than necessary. The best shell buttons had holes that looked almost effortless, tiny dark points in a luminous surface. Behind that clean look was a slow negotiation between hardness and fragility. Wooden buttons and molds allowed the bit to pass more readily, but they had their own hazards. The grain might pull the drill aside. A soft place could enlarge unevenly. On a cloth-covered mold, the drilling might happen before covering, after covering, or not at all if the design used a shank or loop. The maker had to know what the future garment required. A shirt, a waistcoat, a coat cuff, and a child's dress did not all ask the same thing of a button. Drilling also connected the button maker to the sewer. A beautiful disc without useful holes was merely a token. The tailor's needle needed a path. The household mender needed a fastening that could be attached by tired hands beside a fire. The holes had to welcome thread, hold it, and not damage it. In that sense, drilling was a conversation with people the maker might never meet. The bench after drilling was dusted with evidence. Pale bone meal, pearly powder, horn specks, tiny curls of wood, and the occasional broken blank told the story of the hour. Some pieces advanced to smoothing and polishing. Others went into a reject dish, with a crack running from hole to rim. The maker did not need to scold the broken ones. They had already spoken. They reminded the hand to slow down, to sharpen the bit, to mark more carefully, and to let the small tool do its patient turning. By the time a blank reached the smoothing stage, it had already survived several chances to fail. It had been chosen from a larger material, cut into a rough circle, and perhaps drilled with 2 or 4 small holes. Yet it was not ready for clothing. A raw edge could snag thread, scrape skin, catch on wool, or make the whole piece look unfinished. Smoothing was the patient correction of all those little harshnesses. It was work for fingertips as much as for eyes. The edge of a button matters because it is handled constantly. Every fastening and unfastening brings cloth, thread, and skin across that narrow rim. A sharp bone edge could cut the sewing thread slowly. A splinter on a wooden mold could work through fabric. A rough shell disc could chip further once it met pressure in daily use. The maker knew that danger did not always announce itself at the bench. Sometimes it waited until a coat was pulled closed against wind. Smoothing could be done with files, scrapers, abrasive stones, sand, rushes, cloth, or powdered material suited to the surface. The exact method depended on what the maker had and what the button was made from. A small file might round a horn edge. A bit of worn leather with fine abrasive could soften bone. Shell might be ground carefully to take away sharpness while preserving its face. Wooden pieces could be turned, scraped, or rubbed until they no longer held loose fibers. This was slow work, but it was not empty. The hands learned a rhythm. Pick up the blank, turn it, feel the rim, touch the holes, set it down, take the next. In lamplight or weak winter daylight, sight alone could deceive. The fingertips noticed what the eyes missed. A burr near a drill hole, a raised flake on horn, a tiny point on shell, a rough grain line in wood. Each called for a brief return to the tool. The button became finished by many small refusals to leave it troublesome. The holes needed attention too. Thread passed through them under tension, sometimes for years. If the inside of a hole remained gritty or sharp, the finest polishing on the face would not save the button from failure. A worker might clear the openings with a finer point, twist thread through to test them, or rub the mouths of the holes until they lost their bite. Such care was humble. A customer might never praise a smooth hole, but they would notice the button that fell off. Covered buttons had another kind of smoothing. A wooden or bone mold hidden under cloth still had to be kind to the fabric stretched around it. A hard corner beneath silk could make a bright, worn place. A jagged underside could tear the gathered cloth at the back. When tailors or seamstresses prepared covered buttons, they watched for puckers and ridges. The outer surface needed to sit gently, like a small hill under fabric, rather than a lump with corners. Smoothing also made sets more companionable. One button slightly larger, flatter, or sharper than the others could disturb a row. Before calipers and factory gauges became common in mass production, comparison was often by eye and hand. Makers stacked blanks, rolled them together, or held them side by side. They judged whether the coat front would look settled, whether the waistcoat would seem orderly, whether a shirt closure would lie neat. Uniformity came not from a machine's command, but from repeated human correction. There was dust in this work, and quiet fatigue. Fine particles gathered in creases of the fingers. The bench surface became pale or dark, according to the day's material. A candle or lamp might show suspended motes drifting above the worker's hands. Outside, carts passed, bells rang, dogs barked, rain touched the shutters, but the small rounding continued. Nothing about it asked for applause. It only asked not to be skipped. When smoothing was done well, the button appeared almost unchanged to a careless glance. It was still round, still small, still plain perhaps, but it had become safer for thread, kinder to cloth, better under the thumb, and more likely to endure. Much of pre-factory making lived in this quiet difference between rough and ready. The useful object was not born in one decisive blow. It arrived slowly, as the hand removed everything that did not belong. After cutting, drilling, and smoothing came the quieter promise of polish. Not every button needed a shine. Many workaday fastenings were valued because they were strong, cheap, and available. Yet even the plainest button benefited from a finished surface. Polish could close the look of the material, bring out color, soften handling, and suggest care. It did not always mean brilliance. Sometimes it meant only a gentle sheen that told the buyer the work had not been abandoned too soon. Horn was especially changed by polishing. A dull brown disc could become warm and deep, showing streaks like watered tea, smoke, amber, or dark honey. The maker might rub it with cloth, leather, fine abrasives, oil, or other shop preparations according to local habit. Too much heat or pressure could spoil the surface, so patience mattered. The best horn buttons did not shout. They glowed mildly when turned toward light, suitable for coats that needed practical dignity rather than ornament. Bone took polish differently. Its appeal was often cleanliness and pale restraint. A smooth bone button on linen, or a simple garment, could look orderly without seeming rich. Rubbing removed the chalky harshness left by cutting and drilling. It also made the button less eager to take dirt into every scratch. A person who has handled old bone tools or counters knows that use itself can create a soft gloss over time. The button maker tried to begin that process before the object entered the world. Mother of pearl made polishing feel almost like discovery. The shell's light was already there, hidden in layers laid down by a living creature in water. The worker's task was to reveal it without grinding it away. A finished shell button could show green, blue, cream, silver, and rose in a single small face. Under candlelight, the colors were subdued. In daylight, they could shift with a quiet surprise. Such buttons were precious not only because of cost, but because the material made the ordinary act of fastening seem briefly touched by the sea. Metal buttons, when made in small shops rather than great works, also demanded finish. Brass, pewter, silver, and other metals could be cast, stamped, turned, chased, or covered in various ways, depending on place and period. A metal surface might be brightened with powders and cloth, or darkened and cleaned to bring out a design. Soldiers, servants, officials, and fashionable wearers all used metal buttons in different settings. Shine could be a sign of rank, service, pride, or simply good maintenance. Polishing was not only a maker's task. It continued in households. Buttons on coats were brushed when garments were cared for. Metal was rubbed before church, market, parade, or inspection. A dull button might be revived with a bit of cloth at the fireside. Children learned that certain garments had to be treated respectfully, not tossed into a corner. In this way, the finishing of a button extended into the habits of daily life. There was a sensory calm to the work. The repeated motion of cloth over horn, leather over bone, or fine powder across shell made a small hush at the bench. The worker turned each piece, checked the face, examined the rim, and looked for scratches that still caught the light. Some flaws could be softened. Others belonged to the material and had to be accepted. A natural streak, a faint cloud, or a tiny dark speck might remain, reminding everyone that pre-factory buttons were not born from perfect sameness. Sets required special attention. If one button shone more brightly than its neighbors, it might appear newer or finer and break the calm of a row. The maker compared them under steady light, not merely one by one but together. A waistcoat front, a sleeve, or a bodice asked for harmony. The polish, therefore, had to be shared, like a tone of voice, among companions. When the last rubbing was finished, the buttons might be wrapped, counted, stitched to a card, poured into a small box, or delivered loose. They carried no grand announcement of the hours behind them. Still, their surfaces held traces of every decision, where the circle had been cut, how the drill had entered, how the edge had been rounded, and how long the hand had stayed with the cloth. Polish was the final visible kindness before the button left the bench. A tailor did not think of buttons as loose curiosities for very long. On the tailor's table they became decisions in cloth. Their size, weight, color, spacing, and method of attachment changed how a garment behaved. A button that pleased the eye in a dish might prove too heavy for a light waistcoat, too small for a thick coat, or too proud for a sober client. The tailor's work turned a small object into part of a moving body. Before ready-made clothing became common, many garments were shaped for particular people. A coat was cut for a set of shoulders, a waistcoat for a certain chest, breeches for known measurements, a gown or jacket for a wearer whose posture and habits mattered. Buttons joined this personal geometry. They had to meet buttonholes cleanly, sit in the right line, and allow the cloth to close without strain. A row placed poorly could make good fabric look restless. Buttonholes, were their own skilled labor. They were cut into cloth and worked around with thread so they would not fray open. A thick wool coat needed a different buttonhole from a fine linen shirt or silk waistcoat. If the button was too large, forcing it through would stretch the opening. If it was too small, the garment might come undone at an inconvenient moment. Tailors therefore understood buttons not merely by their beauty, but by their passage through cloth. Some buttons were chosen to disappear. Covered buttons used the garment's own fabric or a matching piece, making the fastening nearly invisible from a little distance. This could create elegance, unity, or modesty. The tailor or seamstress had to pull the covering smooth over a mold, gather the back neatly, and attach it firmly. Any wrinkle on the face betrayed impatience. On fine clothing, a row of covered buttons showed discipline precisely because it did not seek attention. Other buttons were meant to be seen. Metal buttons on coats, embroidered buttons on waistcoats, dark horn on country clothing, pearl on shirts, or bright buttons on livery could all speak about use and status. Tailors listened to fashion, but also to purse and practicality. A client might want the newest look without replacing an entire garment. Changing the buttons could refresh an older coat. It was a small economy and a familiar one. The tailor's shop connected many trades. Cloth merchants, dyers, button makers, lace sellers, metal workers, and thread suppliers all touched the finished garment indirectly. In towns, a tailor might know which maker produced reliable horn buttons and which batch of metal ones had weak shanks. In smaller communities, the choice might be limited to what a peddler carried, what a household had saved, or what could be made nearby. The rowel on a coat could quietly reveal the reach of local trade. There were practical frustrations. A set might arrive one button short. A customer might bring old buttons to be reused, and the tailor would have to hide the fact that two were slightly different. Fine buttons might not match the strength of coarse cloth. A beautiful surface could be wasted on a garment that would live in mud and weather. The tailor balanced all this without ceremony, because clothing was expected to work after it was admired. Sewing on the buttons required judgment too. The thread had to be strong enough, the stitches secure, and often a little shank of thread was built between button and cloth so the garment could close comfortably. Heavy coats especially needed room for the buttonhole fabric to sit under the button without strain. Too tight, and the cloth puckered. Too loose, and the button dangled. A small wrapped stem of thread, scarcely noticed by the wearer, could decide whether the front of a coat lay calmly or pulled unevenly. Tailors also dealt with time. Buttons loosened, fashions shifted, bodies changed, and garments returned for alteration. A coat might be let out, taken in, shortened, passed to a younger relative, sold second-hand or remade. Each change might require moving buttons. The old holes in cloth sometimes remained as faint memories. A button did not simply fasten a garment once. It followed the garment through repairs and revisions. In the quiet of a tailor's room, button making met clothing making. The small disc left the bench and entered the architecture of dress. It learned the weight of wool, the fineness of linen, the pride of a waistcoat, the patience of mending, and the ordinary motions of arms and hands. Without the tailor's placement, even a finely made button was only potential. Sewn in the right place, it became a dependable part of how a person stepped into the day. In many homes, buttons lived a second life, in a box, jar, drawer, pouch, or chipped cup. They arrived there after garments wore out, after cuffs frayed beyond repair, after a child outgrew a coat, after a shirt became rags, or after fashion moved on. Before cheap abundance made replacement easy, a household button box was a small treasury. It held not wealth in the grand sense, but possibility, a future mending, a saved trip, a child's amusement, a practical rescue on a wet morning. The box was rarely orderly for long. Large coat buttons knocked against tiny shirt buttons. Horn lay beside bone, cloth-covered pieces beside metal, odd mother-of-pearl discs beside wooden molds whose covers had faded. Some had thread still clinging through their holes. Others had bits of fabric attached at the back, evidence of hurried cutting from a garment no longer worth saving. A few were cracked but kept anyway, because the person sorting them could imagine some future use that did not require perfection. Household saving was not merely thrift as an idea. It was part of daily management. Cloth, thread, pins, hooks, tapes, and buttons all cost money or labor. A missing button on a work shirt might be replaced from the box without visiting a shop. A child's garment might receive a mismatched fastening because warmth mattered more than appearance. A better coat, however, asked for a closer match. Then the box was searched slowly, the contents poured into a lap or onto a table, the small circles spread and compared in lamplight. There was memory in such sorting. One button might have come from a father's waistcoat, another from a mother's old bodice, another from a military coat bought secondhand, another from a christening garment carefully put away. Not every household spoke these histories aloud, and not every button could be identified. Still, familiar objects carry a kind of quiet company. The hand recognizes weight and shape even when the story has blurred. Children often found button boxes fascinating. The objects were safe enough in supervised play, hard enough to clatter, varied enough to sort by color, size, shine, and number of holes. A child might arrange them into families, coins, cakes, soldiers, moons, or stepping stones. In that play, old labor became texture and sound. The polished horn that once fastened an adult coat might become a pretend wheel for a few minutes beside the hearth. For the person responsible for mending, the box was more serious. The right button had to be strong enough, not too thick, not too sharp, and not absurdly unlike its neighbors. If no match could be found, two buttons might be moved so the odd one sat less noticeably. A row could be rearranged with quiet cunning. Sometimes all buttons on a garment were replaced from the box to restore harmony. This took time, but it cost less than buying new. The household box also shows how long handmade and early manufactured objects remained in circulation. A button made in one decade could serve in another. It might pass from a fine garment to a plainer one, then to a child's coat, then finally to the box, where it waited again. Its value declined in fashion, but not always in usefulness. In a world where materials were respected because they were not effortless, even small remnants deserved consideration. Some buttons in the box would never be used. They were too unusual, too worn, too few, or too attached to memory. Yet, they stayed. A single decorative button could remind someone of a dress no longer owned. A brass piece might be kept because it felt too good to discard. A cracked pearl button might be useless for sewing but still beautiful when turned in the hand. Practical storage and sentiment often shared the same dark corner of a drawer. At evening, when mending was done, the box might be closed again with a soft rattle. The repaired garment returned to its peg, chair, chest, or body. The saved buttons settled into darkness, each carrying traces of workshops, tailors, markets, family budgets, and worn cloth. The household button box was modest, but it joined the making of buttons to the keeping of lives. It reminded people that usefulness does not end the first time something comes loose. A young apprentice entering a button-maker's shop did not begin with the finest work. The first lessons were usually plain, repetitive, and easy to undervalue from a distance. Sweep the floor. Sort usable pieces from waste. Carry water. Watch the heating of horn. Turn a handle. Hold a lamp. Count blanks. Fetch thread, files, scraps, or charcoal. In such tasks, the apprentice learned the shop before being trusted with the button. Apprenticeship was not school in the modern sense. It was a household and work arrangement shaped by contract, custom, family strategy, and local trade. A boy, and in some trades or household settings a girl, might be bound for years to a master or mistress. In return for labor, The apprentice received food, lodging, discipline, and instruction. The bargain could be fair, harsh, affectionate, exploitative, or ordinary in all the mixed ways human arrangements tend to be. The bench taught skill, but the shop taught obedience first. The simplest jobs could still matter. Sorting bone required noticing density, color, and weakness. Picking through horn scraps taught the eye to see layers and cracks. Sweeping around shell work reminded the lungs and skin that dust was part of the trade. Counting blanks trained patience with numbers, because a missing button in a set caused trouble later. The apprentice who treated scraps as meaningless would be corrected. In small trades, material was money already half spent. Only gradually did the hand earn sharper tools. A beginner might smooth rough pieces under supervision, rub finished buttons with cloth, or practice drilling on blanks not meant for sale. The master watched for pressure, posture, haste, and carelessness. Too much force broke things. Too little attention made hidden failures. The lesson was not merely how to make a hole or round an edge, but how to notice when the material changed under the tool. There were rhythms to the working day. Morning light was useful for inspection. Dull weather slowed some tasks. Heating, pressing, cutting, drilling, and polishing might be divided among workers according to ability. In a small shop, everyone heard the mistakes. A cracked shell, a snapped bit, a scorched piece of horn, or a tray spilled onto the floor could turn heads without a word. Shame was one teacher, though not always the kindest one. The apprentice also learned the speech of the trade. Names for tools, sizes, materials, flaws, orders, customers, and qualities became familiar through repetition. A master might say that a piece was too green, too thin, too proud, too dull, too coarse, or good enough for common work. Such phrases carried judgment built from years at the bench. The apprentice absorbed them until they became part of seeing. Skilled work often begins when language and touch start to agree. Not all instruction was formal. Much was imitation. The young worker watched how an experienced hand picked up a blank, how it turned a button toward light, how it rejected one piece quickly and studied another longer. The body learned by copying small gestures. Even the way tools were laid down mattered. A bench in order saved time and prevented damage. A bench in confusion swallowed drills, scratched faces, mixed sizes, and invited scolding. In some places, apprentices hoped eventually to become journeymen, earning wages and perhaps traveling for work. A few might become masters if they could gather tools, capital, permission, reputation, and customers. Others remained laborers, moved to related trades, or left the craft entirely. The path was not guaranteed. Skill opened doors only when the wider world allowed them to open. Still, the apprentice's years left marks. The repeated turning of small circles trained the fingers. The smell of warmed horn, damp wool from a tailor's parcel, bone dust, lamp smoke, metal polish, and wooden shavings settled into memory. The trade became not one great secret, but many small recognitions. This blank will split. That edge is not ready. This set will please the tailor. That shine is enough. By the time an apprentice could be trusted with saleable work, the button had become a teacher in miniature. It punished haste, rewarded attention, and required care out of proportion to its size. The young worker may have entered the shop seeing only little discs. Years later, those little discs contained material, time, customers, rules, habits, and the quiet pride of making something that would hold. Long before factories organized work by engines, wages, and schedules of production, many crafts were shaped by guilds, companies, civic rules, and local privileges. Button making did not stand apart from that world. Depending on time and place, makers of buttons might be connected to broader trades in metal, horn, bone, turning, embroidery, haberdashery, tailoring, or small wares. The boundaries were not always neat. A button was simple enough to cross categories and important enough to be argued over. Guilds were not only romantic brotherhoods of skilled artisans, though they could cultivate ceremony and pride. They were also systems of control. They regulated who could practice a trade, who could sell in a town, how apprentices were bound, how long training lasted, what standards were expected, and sometimes what materials or marks could be used. Such rules protected customers in one sense, but they also protected established masters from too much competition. Like the buttons themselves, guilds had both useful and constraining sides. For a small object, a button could involve many claims. If it was metal, did it belong to founders, smiths, pewterers, brass workers, or specialized button makers? If it was covered in silk, did the cloth trade, the tailor, or the button maker have the stronger hand in its production? If thread was wrapped around a form, was the work closer to passementerie, needlework, or garment making? Historical records often show crafts overlapping because real objects refuse tidy categories. In towns with strong corporate traditions, a master's right to trade might depend on citizenship, fees, apprenticeship, and recognition by other masters. A shop sign, a stall, or a place in a market could represent years of negotiation. The customer who bought a set of buttons saw only a modest purchase. Behind it might stand an entire civic order: inspections, disputes, fines, feast days, oaths, widows' rights, and quarrels over outsiders selling cheaper goods. Quality was one reason for regulation. A poor button could fail quickly, and a fraudulent material could deceive the buyer. A surface might be made to imitate something dearer. A metal could be too thin, a shank weak, a covered button badly formed, a set uneven. Rules and reputations helped customers trust what they could not fully test at the counter. Even so, enforcement varied. Markets always had shadows. Informal sellers, rural makers, imported goods, second-hand pieces, and household production beyond official reach. Guild life also shaped apprentices. A young person did not merely learn from a master's temper and tools. They entered a regulated ladder. Years of service might be recorded. Conduct could matter. Marriage, citizenship, religion, family standing, and money could influence advancement in many cities. To become a master often required a masterpiece, fee, or proof of competence, though the details changed widely. The button on a coat may seem far from these institutions, but it traveled through them all the same. Women's labor complicates the story. Many women made, covered, sold, sorted, repaired, or traded buttons, sometimes within households, sometimes as widows continuing a shop, sometimes as wage workers, sometimes in informal economies overlooked by official records. Guild documents may name men more often, but garments were maintained by many hands. A button sewn back onto a child's coat by a mother, servant, sister, or neighbor belonged to the history of the trade, as surely as a master's stamped metal piece. As markets widened, guild control faced pressure. Traveling merchants, imported wares, rural outwork, changing fashions, and later mechanized production all challenged older privileges. Before full factory dominance, there was already a world of mixed making. Some buttons from regulated urban shops, some from cottage labor, some from tailors, some saved from older garments, some brought from distant places by trade. The pre-factory world was not still. It moved slowly in carts, ships, packs, pockets, and boxes. For the maker within a gilded town, rules could feel like both shelter and wall. They offered identity, standards, mutual aid, and a place in civic life. They could also limit invention, exclude newcomers, and keep prices or methods under watch. The bench existed inside these larger arrangements. A drill, file, polishing cloth, and tray of blanks may look private and quiet, but the right to use them for sale might depend on public permission. A finished button, therefore, carried more than material labor. It carried traces of law, custom, competition, training, trust, and conflict. When it passed through a tailor's hand, entered a household box, or fastened a traveler's coat, those traces became invisible. Yet they remained part of its making. The small circle held not only cloth together, but also a fragment of the old social order that governed who was allowed to make, sell, learn, and belong. Peddler's pack brought the button trade to doors that stood far from any proper shop. Before regular rail service and catalog orders changed the rhythm of buying, many households met the wider market through a person on foot, on a small cart, or beside a tired horse at the edge of the yard. The pack might hold needles, pins, ribbons, tape, combs, thread, laces, buckles, hooks, and a few cards or strings of buttons. Some were plain horn or bone. Some were wood darkened by handling. A few shone with brass or pewter enough to catch a child's eye in the doorway. The peddler did not merely sell goods. He carried news of roads, prices, marriages, military movements, poor harvests, fairs, and distant fashions in towns the household might never see. Buttons were light enough to travel well, small enough to tuck among other wares, and useful enough that a customer could justify a purchase even in a hard season. A woman might choose 6 for a child's coat, 2 larger ones for a man's waistcoat, or a mixed handful for a mending box. The transaction was modest, but it linked a farmhouse bench to workshops, ports, pack-horse tracks, toll roads, and the slow commerce of early modern Europe and America. There was patience in this kind of selling. Rain softened the lane. Clay clung to boots and wheels. The seller had to judge which houses might buy, which dogs were best avoided, and which door should be approached with a respectful cough rather than a knock. Inside, the pack was opened carefully, because the display itself mattered. Strings of buttons could be laid across a table like little samples of order. A horn button showed its brown clouding in the light from the hearth. A white bone button looked clean against dark cloth. A metal button seemed more ambitious, fit for a coat worn to church, market, or militia drill. Trust was part of the price. Rural buyers had reason to be cautious. A peddler might vanish down the road before a weak shank, bad plating, or cracked edge revealed itself. Some places required licenses for itinerant sellers, partly to collect fees, and partly to keep watch over strangers moving from parish to parish. Yet people still depended on them. A village tailor could not stock every size. A household might be too busy, too poor, or too remote to send someone into town. The peddler's arrival turned the doorway into a small marketplace, with the rain outside and the smell of wool, smoke, and damp leather inside. Buttons suited such trade because they belonged to both necessity and hope. The plainest fastener kept cold air from entering a sleeve or bodice. The slightly finer one promised neatness. If a girl had outgrown a dress, new buttons might help the altered garment seem less like a compromise. If a man's old coat had been brushed and mended for another winter, a replaced front button could make the repair look deliberate. These small improvements mattered in communities where clothing was read closely and where waste was remembered. The peddler also carried variety into places where most things were familiar. A local maker might shape the same kinds of wooden buttons year after year, but the traveling pack could offer goods from another valley, a port town, or a manufacturing district just beginning to specialize. Mother of pearl from Shell, metal from Birmingham workshops, horn from cattle trade, and covered forms from urban tailors all moved by stages through hands and ledgers before reaching the kitchen table. No single journey was grand, but together they made a quiet network of fastenings crossing the countryside. When the pack was tied again, the room returned to itself. The buyer counted coins or promised payment after market day. The seller stepped back into weather, carrying fewer buttons and a little more local knowledge. Behind him, the purchase pieces waited in a drawer, a work basket, or a paper twist by the fire. They had traveled farther than their size suggested. One day they would be sewn onto cloth, and the road would disappear into the ordinary act of closing a garment. Along trade routes, buttons moved as quietly as seed. They did not require a hold of their own, or a guard with a musket. They slipped into barrels, chests, canvas sacks, wrapped papers, tailor's parcels, and the side compartments of merchants' packs. A shipment of cloth might carry buttons as a practical companion. A consignment of haberdashery could include them by the gross, counted carefully, bundled by kind, and described in a clerk's hand that tried to make small goods behave like large ones. In this way the humble fastening followed roads, rivers, canals, and coastal vessels, traveling through the same systems that carried grain, salt, wool. The route mattered because materials were unevenly scattered. Shell buttons began with rivers, shores, and later with ocean trade. Horn depended on cattle. Bone followed butchering, glue making, and other trades that used animal remains with thrift rather than sentiment. Metal buttons required mines, smelters, rolling mills, wire drawers, dezinkers, and workshops where brass, pewter, tin, or copper alloys could be worked into shape. Cloth-covered buttons needed woven fabric, paper, or wooden molds, and patient fingers. A finished button, small as it was, often held a map inside it. Rivers were especially kind to small cargo. Barges moved slowly but cheaply, and a box that would have burdened a pack animal could ride under a tarred cover beside heavier goods. On a canal boat, button cards might rest near bundles of ribbon, combs, pins, and tapes, all destined for shops where customers wanted choice in small quantities. In port towns, merchants watched the tide, the customs officer, and the weather. Buttons made of pearl shell, or those imitating more expensive materials, could pass through warehouses smelling of rope, tar, salt, tea, and damp timber before any tailor saw them. Inland roads were less gentle. Ruts broke axles. Winter shortened the day. A carrier might delay a parcel because a bridge washed out or because horses were needed elsewhere. Dust settled into packing straw in summer. Water found its way into paper in autumn. Still, trade continued, because clothing could not wait forever. A village shopkeeper who ordered buttons from a town supplier needed enough sizes to satisfy uncertain customers. Too many of one pattern tied up money. Too few meant a lost sale, and perhaps a garment left unfinished on a chair. The bookkeeping of small things required attention. Buttons were counted by dozens and grosses, sorted by diameter, material, color, and quality. A merchant might distinguish common bone from polished bone, japanned metal from gilt, plain wood from covered forms. A mistake on the invoice could travel all the way to a shop drawer, where a customer discovered that the promised dark coat buttons were too pale, too small, or too showy for the cloth. In a world before instant correction, accuracy had to be built into habit. Trade routes also carried taste. A style popular in one city could appear months later in a provincial market, softened by imitation and price. Military contracts, court fashion, mourning customs, church-going clothes, and working garments all influenced demand. When roads improved and canals multiplied in the 18th and early 19th centuries, a rural customer could encounter a wider world of choices without leaving home. The button became one of the little signals that fashion was no longer confined to capitals. Yet these networks remained personal at many points. A carrier knew which shop paid promptly. A merchant trusted a maker whose goods rarely cracked. A tailor remembered which supplier sent buttons that held their finish after rain. Reputation traveled with the cargo, sometimes more securely than the cargo itself. If a box arrived damaged, someone had to write, complain, wait, or accept the loss. Small objects made large systems visible through delays and disappointments, as much as through successful delivery. By the time a button reached a sleeve or coat front, the journey had grown invisible. No one wearing it felt the barge rocking at night, the toll gate opening before dawn, the clerk sand-drying ink, or the shopkeeper sorting sizes into shallow drawers. The wearer felt only the closing of cloth. That was enough. The button had completed the purpose of all those routes by becoming ordinary, useful, and close to the body. In many towns, a button was not only a thing to be made, it was a thing one had the right to make. Guilds and municipal regulations shaped much of early craft life, sometimes directly and sometimes through neighboring trades. The rules varied from place to place, but the pattern was familiar. Apprentices learned under masters. Journeymen worked for wages, while seeking skill, money, and opportunity. Masters paid dues, kept standards, and defended privileges. If buttons were made of metal, horn, cloth, or wood, they might fall near the concerns of metalworkers, turners, tailors, haberdashers, or specialized button makers. The jurisdictions often blurred at the edges. A guild could protect quality, at least in theory. It might require proper materials, honest measures, recognizable marks, or limits on who could sell within the town. Poorly made buttons wasted thread and damaged garments. Metal too thin could bend. A shank badly fixed could break. A sharp edge could fray cloth. Customers wanted some assurance that a purchase from a shop was better than a doubtful bargain from a stranger. Regulation answered that worry by turning skill into a public promise. But rules also protected income. A master who had spent years in training and paid for the rights of his trade did not welcome someone producing cheaper goods in a back room. Disputes over small wares could become surprisingly serious because small wares were sold in number. A single button cost little. Dozens and grosses made a livelihood. Town records across Europe are full of quarrels about who may sell, where markets may be held, what counts as foreign work, and how goods should be inspected. Buttons belonged to that world of watchful neighbors and guarded privileges. The workshop under regulation had its own quiet discipline. A boy apprenticed to the trade might begin by sweeping, sorting blanks, carrying fuel, cleaning tools, or turning a simple wheel. He learned the smell of heated metal, scraped horn, damp cloth, or bone dust before he learned the pride of finishing anything. The master's wife, daughters, or hired women might also cover buttons, sew fabric tightly around molds, sort sizes, or keep accounts, even when official records named only male masters. The legal shape of the trade rarely contained a whole reality of labor. Inspection could be formal or informal. A guild officer might examine goods. A shopkeeper might reject a lot. A tailor might complain in a voice low enough to be polite and clear enough to harm reputation. In a small town, reputation was a kind of measuring stick. Everyone knew which maker's pieces cracked, which merchant mixed inferior buttons among better ones, and which household always saved old fastenings because new ones could not be afforded. The written rule and the whispered judgment worked side by side. Regulation also met fashion, and fashion was restless. If a new kind of covered button became popular, did it belong to tailors, button makers, or women doing piecework at home? If stamped metal buttons could be made more cheaply with improved tools, did older guild rules still apply? If imported goods undercut local prices, should the town forbid them, or accept that customers like them? These were not abstract questions. They entered kitchens, shops, and council rooms because they affected rent, bread, dowries, debts, and the dignity of skilled work. Some rules softened over time. Others were bypassed. Rural outwork, merchant capital, and expanding trade made it harder for town guilds to control every object. A merchant could supply materials to scattered workers, gather finished buttons, and sell them under a broader network than a single master's shop. This did not end regulation at once, but it changed the balance. The button trade began to lean away from the closed town room and toward the wider market. Still, the guild world left a mark. It reminds us that pre-factory making was not simply romantic freedom at the bench. It was training, permission, obligation, inspection, rivalry, and pride. A button carried the hand that shaped it, but also the rules around that hand. When the finished piece passed into a garment, the wearer did not see the bylaws, dues, disputes, or careful measurements. Yet those quiet structures had helped decide its size, strength, price, and place in the world. On a soldier's coat, a button had to do more than decorate. It fastened wool against wind, kept facings in place, held gaiters, cuffs, pockets, and equipment straps in reasonable order, and helped an officer recognize a regiment at a glance. Military clothing changed by country and century, but buttons repeatedly became part of the visible language of command. They could bear numbers, crowns, eagles, anchors, state seals, or simple stamp designs. Even when plain, their arrangement on a coat told others something about rank, service, and discipline. Military demand mattered to makers because armies consumed goods in quantity. A civilian tailor might order enough buttons for a few coats. A government contract would require thousands, delivered to a schedule, and judged by inspectors who cared about uniformity. Before fully mechanized factories, this created pressure on workshops, merchants, and subcontractors. Metal had to be rolled or cast, blanks cut, faces stamped or engraved, shanks attached, surfaces finished, and lots counted. The work was still done by hands and simple machines, but the scale pointed toward a different future. The button-on campaign also had a hard life. Rain worked under wool. Mud dried around hems. Smoke, sweat, salt air, and wagon dust dulled metal. A soldier, missing one front button, might feel cold during a night watch, or find his coat hanging poorly when he stood in line. Spare buttons therefore traveled with sewing kits, quartermaster stores, and the patient mending of camp life. Needles appeared beside fires, in barracks, on ships, and in temporary shelters, where men repaired the outward signs of order before the next march. Uniform buttons were not always fine. Some were pewter, brass, tin, or composite materials chosen for price as much as appearance. Officers might purchase better clothing and brighter fittings, while common soldiers received what the supply system could provide. Yet even a cheap button became official once it was attached to a regulated garment. It belonged to the state's attempt to make many bodies appear as one body. A row of matching buttons helped turn individual men, with private histories and worn boots, into a visible unit. Naval clothing brought another set of needs. Salt air was unkind to metal. Coats and jackets had to endure wet decks, rope work, tar, and the confined storage of ships. Buttons marked naval identity, and sometimes authority, but they also simply had to stay attached while a man climbed, hauled, or stood watch. A lost button at sea could not be replaced by walking to the next market. The small mending stores kept aboard ship were part of survival as much as neatness. Military use also spread styles into civilian life. After wars, surplus buttons could enter local markets. Veterans kept coats, altered uniforms, reused metal fastenings, or carried bright buttons home in boxes. Children might find them in drawers long after the marching had ended. In some places, patriotic designs, regimental associations, or naval motifs influenced ordinary clothing. The boundary between military supply and civilian fashion was porous, especially when practical goods were too valuable to discard. For makers, the Army's need for consistency encouraged measurement, division of labor, and closer oversight. A contract did not want every button charmingly different. It wanted numbers, sizes, matching finish, and delivery. This was one of the quiet paths from craft toward industrial production. The old shop could make excellent things, but war asked for many things alike, and it asked quickly. That demand helped strengthen the habits that factories would later expand. Standard gauges, repeated operations, specialized tools, inspection, and bulk packing. Still, the soldier experienced the button in a personal way. It pressed under a strap, warmed under the hand, caught on a blanket, or clicked softly against a cartridge box. It was polished before parade and ignored during exhaustion. It held a coat closed while letters were read, bread was eaten, and boots were dried near a fire. In the official record, it might be only a supply item, but on the body, it belonged to cold mornings, long marches, and the fragile wish to keep order in unsettled places. Fashion often announces itself in cloth, color, and shape, but buttons have long helped it speak more softly. A row down the front of a coat, a cluster at a cuff, a bright point on a waistcoat, or a covered button blending into silk could change the manner of a garment without changing its whole structure. Before factories filled shops with abundant fasteners, each choice carried weight. A button could be thrifty, respectable, playful, sober, elegant, or deliberately plain. In courts and prosperous towns, buttons sometimes became signs of display. 18th century waistcoats might use embroidered, metal, paste, enamel, or fabric-covered buttons to continue a pattern across the body. Some were made less for hard wear than for conversation, candlelight, and careful rooms. A gentleman's coat could carry many buttons, including some that served no practical purpose Once fashion had turned them into ornaments. The fastening had become a small stage for taste. Such elegance did not stay completely separate from everyday life. Fashion moved through prince, travelers, servants, soldiers, merchants, and second-hand clothing. A rural tailor might hear of a new cut before seeing it. A peddler might offer a cheaper imitation of an urban button. A household with limited means could update an older garment by changing the fastenings. New buttons on old cloth were a quiet compromise between desire and economy. They allowed people to participate in style without paying for a full wardrobe. Women's clothing used buttons in varied ways depending on period, region, and garment. Laces, pins, hooks, tapes, and ties remained important, but buttons appeared on bodices, jackets, riding habits, gloves, shoes, and children's clothes. Covered buttons could disappear into the fabric, giving a smooth and coordinated look. Contrasting buttons could draw the eye. On a child's garment, they might be chosen for strength above beauty, but even there, a mother or seamstress could prefer one shade or surface over another. Buttons also carried the language of respectability. In many communities, neat closure mattered. A missing button could suggest poverty, neglect, or simple misfortune. A properly mended row suggested discipline, care, and household order. This was not always fair, but clothing has rarely been fair in the judgments it invites. The person who spent a dark evening replacing a lost button was not merely repairing cloth. They were repairing how the garment would be read by neighbors, employers, parishioners, customers, or kin. Materials shaped these meanings. Dark horn and wood suited work coats and rural dress. Bone could look clean and modest. Brass offered brightness. Mother of pearl gave a cool, pale shimmer, especially valued later for shirts and finer garments. Black buttons served mourning customs and sober clothing. Covered buttons matched the cloth so closely that the maker's care became almost invisible. Each material had its own behavior under light, under weather, and under the fingers. Fashion also created waste and labor. When styles changed, useful buttons could seem old-fashioned. Yet, in a pre-factory household, they were seldom thrown away casually. They were cut from worn garments, saved in boxes, sorted by size, and later sewn onto something else. A fashionable button might descend into usefulness after its moment of display had passed. It could leave a fine coat, spend years in a drawer, and reappear on a child's jacket where nobody remembered its first ambition. The row of small circles, therefore, belonged to both dream and duty. It made the body presentable, kept warmth near the skin, and allowed the wearer to enter the world with a little more confidence. In a wealthy room, buttons could glitter. In a poor room, they could simply hold. Between those extremes lay most human clothing, repaired, altered, judged, cherished, and carried through seasons. The button was never only decoration, and never only utility. It rested exactly where fashion and need touched. The transition to factories did not arrive as a single loud door closing. It came by stages. A better press, a more regular dye, a powered wheel, a merchant gathering scattered workers under closer control, a workshop growing too large to feel like a household, a room where one person cut blanks all day while another drilled holes and another polished edges. Buttons were well suited to this change because they were small, repeatable, and wanted in large numbers. The more clothing markets expanded, the more valuable sameness became. Some of the earliest pressures came from metal. Stamped buttons required dyes that could impress a design again and again. Once the dye existed, it made sense to use it heavily. Brass and other alloys could be rolled into sheets, cut into blanks, formed, decorated, and fitted with shanks in a sequence of operations. Each step invited a specialized tool. Each tool invited someone to use it faster. The button remained small, but the organization around it became larger, louder, and more exact. Birmingham and other manufacturing districts became associated with metal smallwares, including buttons, buckles, toys, and fittings. These places drew together skill, capital, invention, and trade. They did not erase hand labor. Rather, they surrounded it with machinery, division of labor, and market ambition. A worker might no longer make a whole button from beginning to end. One might feed blanks to a press. Another might solder or attach shanks. Another might polish. Another might pack counted quantities into papers or boxes for merchants who sold far beyond the town. This was efficient, and efficiency changed price. Buttons that had once been dear enough to save carefully became more available to ordinary buyers. A shop could stock more sizes. A tailor could promise matching sets. Military and institutional orders could be filled with greater confidence. Fashion could spread more quickly because the material evidence of fashion could be produced in quantity. A style no longer needed to wait for many independent hands to imitate it slowly. Factory methods also changed time. In the old workshop, rhythm followed daylight, household interruptions, individual judgment, and the varied pace of materials. In a factory, the clock grew stronger. Bells, shifts, output targets, wages, and overseers pressed on the day. This did not make every factory identical, and many early factories were smaller and less dramatic than later industrial mills. Still, the difference was real. The worker's body began to answer less to the whole life of an object and more to a single repeated part of its making. For the button itself, the results could be admirable. Better made clearer designs. Improved polishing gave brighter surfaces. Standard gouges helped holes line up and sizes remain consistent. Consumers benefited from reliability and price. Poor families could replace missing fastenings more easily. Children's clothing, work shirts, uniforms, and ready-made garments all depended on abundant small components. Industrial production brought genuine relief from scarcity. Yet the change also narrowed certain kinds of knowledge. A craftsperson who selected material, shaped it, corrected faults, and saw the finished object enter use held a broad understanding. A factory hand might know one operation with great speed, but never choose the material, meet the customer, or mend the garment. The intelligence did not disappear. It was redistributed into machines, managers, gauges, patterns, and repeated motion. Some workers gained wages and regular employment. Others lost control over pace, method, and pride. The first factory-shaped buttons therefore belonged to an in-between world. They were not yet the anonymous plastic pieces of later centuries, but neither were they entirely the products of a single bench. They carried the marks of industrial thinking, uniformity, quantity, replaceability, and organized repetition. When one of them was sewn onto a coat, it held the cloth well. It also held a new arrangement of labor, one that would soon change not only buttons, but the whole landscape of ordinary things. When buttons became cheap and plentiful, much was gained. It is important to say this plainly. Abundance meant warmer clothing, easier repair, wider access to fashion, more reliable uniforms, fuller shop drawers, and less anxiety over a single lost fastening. A mother could replace a child's missing button without sacrificing too much. A worker could buy a card of practical buttons instead of hunting through old garments. Ready-made clothing became possible partly because small components could be supplied in predictable quantities. Industrial production solved real problems. Yet abundance has a quiet cost. When an object becomes easy to replace, people stop noticing the life inside it. The pre-factory button was not always beautiful, and it was not always lovingly made, but it usually demanded attention. Someone chose the material because it was available, durable, affordable, or handsome. Someone shaped it with tools that needed sharpening and hands that grew tired. Someone saved it from a worn garment because it still had use. The button's value encouraged memory. What faded first was the habit of looking closely. A horn button is cloudy depth. Bone carries tiny pores and slight warmth. Shell changes as it turns in light. Wood darkens where fingers touch it. Covered buttons hold the texture of fabric, and the tension of thread pulled tight behind the form. Cheap mass production did not destroy these qualities at once, but it made them less necessary. The buyer increasingly asked whether the button matched, whether it was affordable, and whether there were enough of them. The intimate study of material receded. Another loss lay in repair culture. Earlier households kept buttons because they represented future usefulness. Boxes, tins, bags, and drawers gathered orphaned fastenings from dead coats, outgrown dresses, torn shirts, and discarded uniforms. Sorting them was a small domestic archive. A child could learn family history through a handful of odd pieces. This one from a grandfather's coat, that one from a mother's best dress, a dull metal one from a military jacket, a little white one from baby clothes. As replacement became easier, the urgency of saving weakened. The maker's relationship to the finished object also changed. In hand and workshop production, a person might see the result of several stages and understand how defects formed. Under divided labor, skill became narrower. This could produce excellent goods, but it could also separate workers from the meaning of what they made. A hand feeding blanks into a machine all day might become extraordinarily practiced, yet the button as a whole belonged to the employer's order book, the machine's rhythm, and the market's demand more than to the worker's judgment. Communities changed as well. Small workshops, peddlers, local tailors, guild systems, and household mending had formed a web of relationships around clothing. Factories and large distribution networks did not simply add more buttons. They rearranged authority. Decisions about size, style, material, and price moved toward manufacturers, merchants, and distant markets. Local preference did not vanish, but it was increasingly answered from far away. The village drawer held goods shaped by industrial districts the buyer might never see. There was also a loss of slowness. Slowness is not always virtue. It can mean poverty, inconvenience, and exclusion. Still, the slower world asked people to weigh small choices. Should this button be saved? Can the old coat be refreshed? Which material will survive winter? Does this piece deserve the better garment? Such questions made the button part of care. Cheapness shortened the conversation. Convenience entered, and with it came a little forgetfulness. The story is therefore not a simple fall from craft into industry. It is a trade. People gained access, consistency, and relief from scarcity. They lost some intimacy with materials, some local knowledge, some continuity between making and using, and some memory stored in ordinary objects. A button in a modern drawer may still be useful, but it rarely asks to be contemplated. The older button, saved and handled, asks more gently. It asks where it came from, whose fingers chose it, and why someone thought it worth keeping. By the end of the story, the button returns to a drawer. This is where many of them have always rested between duties, away from the workshop, the road, the market, the barracks, the ship, the tailor's board, and the factory floor. A drawer is not a museum, though it sometimes behaves like one. It gathers what a household cannot quite throw away. Spare fastenings, lengths of thread, a thimble, a bent hook, a broken buckle, perhaps a needle packet gone soft at the corners. Among these small things, a button waits without impatience. It may be made of bone, worn smooth by years of handling. It may be horn, dark at the rim and amber where the light passes through. It may be shell, pale as winter morning. It may be wood from a workshop where shavings once curled onto the floor. It may be metal stamped by an early press, polished by a worker who never knew the wearer's name. Or it may be covered in cloth, its core hidden, its usefulness modest and complete. Whatever its material, it has crossed more human care than its size reveals. To follow the button before factories is to follow many kinds of work. There were gatherers of shell, bone, horn, metal, and wood. There were turners, cutters, drillers, stampers, polishers, coverers, tailors, seamstresses, apprentices, peddlers, merchants, soldiers, sailors, shopkeepers, guild officers, mothers, fathers, and children, learning to sew by making uneven stitches. None of them needed the object to be grand. They needed it to hold. Holding is a humble action, but it organizes daily life. A closed coat lets a person walk farther in cold weather. A fastened cuff keeps cloth from catching. A neat waistcoat helps someone stand before customers with confidence. A mended dress allows another season of wear. A uniform button supports the appearance of order. A saved button protects the future from small emergencies. These are not dramatic achievements, Yet life is full of such quiet supports. Factories changed the story, as they changed so many stories. They made buttons cheaper, more consistent, and more widely available. They also moved labor into larger systems where speed and sameness mattered. The older world of scattered benches, peddlers' packs, guild rules, household saving, and patient material knowledge did not vanish in a single year. It faded unevenly, surviving in repairs, special trades, rural habits, and family drawers. Even now, when fasteners are easily bought, many people still keep a small collection of spares. The old instinct remains. There's comfort in noticing this. History is often told through kings, wars, inventions, and great machines, but ordinary objects carry quieter evidence. A button remembers the body because it was made for the body. It sits where fingers can find it. It fails in ways that matter immediately. It is missed when gone and forgotten when it works. That balance between importance and invisibility makes it a good companion for a slow history. If you imagine one last room, make it simple. Evening has settled. Coat lies over a chair. Someone has taken a button from a little box and threaded a needle by lamplight. Outside, the road is dark. No market calls, no press falls, no guild officer measures, no drummer summons a regiment. There's only cloth in the lap, thread drawn through, and the small click of a button against a wooden table. The stitch is pulled snug, not too tight. The thread passes again and again until the fastening is secure. Then the needle is set down. The repaired garment is folded or hung where morning will find it. In the drawer, the remaining buttons settle back together, each with its own unnoticed journey. Nothing more is required of them for now. They wait in the dark, patient, round, and ready for the next ordinary need.